So now we are going to return to Michelle Sawka, who will be speaking about valuation approaches to natural assets in conversation with Jennifer Lavalley from Oxford County. So I will turn it over to Michelle.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome everyone. This is the last session of the workshop, and we're really trying to make this a bit more of a workshop. Now, there's so many people on the line, we've had to make some changes to how we would traditionally structure this, but ultimately we're all going to work through a look at a valuation approach to a natural asset example. So I thought I would take a moment here to address some of the questions around valuing a really old tree from before the break. So we're going to walk through a method today that does account for the size of the tree. But something important to keep in mind is that we're using accounting methods and financial terminology, asset, infrastructure, value. And this is important to build accountability for green infrastructure in asset management planning. And honestly, when most of our trees are removed across the province for development or any reason, their default value right now is 0. They're not in financial statements. They're often not in asset management plans. They are removed with no cost. So asset management planning really helps us change that and give trees, and not just the 100-year-old trees, all of our trees, a value that is above that default 0 value. But we also really need to recognize that nature has value beyond its capital functions and services. So while we use these methods to help get green infrastructure properly managed and funded, we also need to recognize that in terms of tree protection, if that's our goal, this is really just one piece of the puzzle. So sometimes I hear people say, "Oh, if we include trees in asset management plans, that's going to help protect our trees," and it will, but it's not going to do all the work for us. And we absolutely need other decision processes and some that acknowledge nature's other intrinsic values that we cannot use through accounting processes. So again, this example today is going to account for size of tree, but it's really just one piece of the overall tree protection puzzle, and that's really important to keep in mind. So to make this session a little bit more interactive, we asked for a volunteer who is willing to put forward some of their data and work through a valuation method with me live today. So we also have a couple poll questions. We'll be looking for input from the whole audience. But first, I'm going to introduce our volunteer today. So it's Jennifer Lavalley from Oxford County. I'm going to ask that Malik unmute her and see if she'll introduce herself and her jurisdiction.
Yeah, so I am the coordinator of asset management here at Oxford County. We are located in southwestern Ontario with a population of over 110,000. So we are an upper tier municipality. We have 8 lower tier municipalities. 5 of them are rural, 3 of them are urban. So our urban areas are Woodstock, Ingersoll, and Tillsonburg, the largest of which is Woodstock, and that accounts for over 40,000 in our population there alone.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for volunteering today. So before we start to dig into Oxford County's data, I wanted to take a couple minutes to provide a really quick crash course in accounting for those of us who are not accountants. And this is incredibly basic accounting theory. It's very high level, but it's important to understand as part of the valuation methodology. So there are generally 2 high-level accounting approaches to valuation. The first is historical cost. So that is the original cost to purchase or construct an asset. And then the second is current cost. So that is the cost of the asset to replace it in today's dollars. So for asset management planning, the industry best practice and the direction in the Ontario regulation is to use something called current replacement cost as asset value, if you can. So I'm going to read you the full definition of current replacement cost, and bear with me. I know it's not riveting, but it is very relevant to the rest of this session. So current replacement cost is the full cost of replacing an existing asset with a new asset that will provide the current required levels of service in the same operating environment. You should also consider changes in technology and construction methods and materials that use the least cost option. So in that definition up on the slide, you can see that I have bolded the text that states that new assets need to provide the current required levels of service. So while traditional assets can be built to immediately provide the required level of service once they're operational, assets with living components, they can take time to establish themselves and grow. So in that time, the services are increasing, but the desired service levels might not be met for a while. So an example here is that the services provided by a mature forest would not be met by replacing it with a brand new plantation. So we're going to get into an option for addressing this issue as we work through our example. So our example today, as I mentioned, comes from Oxford County and Jennifer. She's provided us with data on some of their street trees. So they have an inventory for trees on their streets that are located within the City of Woodstock, which is one of their 3 urban municipalities. So our goal today is to calculate an asset value for those street trees. And we want to really use a method that calculates current replacement cost in a way that is fairly simple and easy to replicate in the future. As Sarah talked about earlier, simple and replicable is very relevant. And today it's relevant because we don't have data for all of their trees across their jurisdiction. So someday they might want to use this method for all of their trees. And we don't want it to involve complex ecological modeling. That would be difficult for sort of the average staff member to understand and implement. Final thing to note here is that we're focusing our example on street trees. So this exact method would be the same for individual park trees, but other green infrastructure assets like forests or wetlands or low impact development features, it would not be exactly the same. So for those assets, you would still use current replacement costs, but with a slightly different application method. So unfortunately, we don't have time today to go through an example for every asset type. But if at the end of today you really, really want more, GEO does have some more detailed training on all the different asset types, and I've included an email on this slide if you are interested in getting more detailed training. Okay, so the data you need to calculate current replacement costs for any asset type is a benchmark cost and the quantity. So the benchmark cost in our example is the average cost per street tree planted, and the quantity of this asset would be the number of trees. So once you have those two numbers, you multiply them together to get your asset value. Now, if we're going to address the delay in service delivery as a tree grows, you will need one additional piece of information, and that is tree size. And ideally, you'll have this in either the CLTA trunk formula method or diameter information. So when it comes to benchmark costs, I'll give you a little bit of a sense of what we're looking for. So first, the benchmark cost will generally be the cost to purchase or construct the asset. And I will quickly note here that, some natural assets like forests or wetlands, you would actually be looking at restoration costs because they don't have a purchase price. They're generally inherited. But for our example, for street trees, they require planting and they require purchase, so there is a cost associated with them, and that is the cost we're going to be looking for. And ideally, we're looking for an internal cost to a municipality. You might have a recent invoice from a tree planting, or a capital project progress payment that has trees broken out in the line items. If you don't have internal costs, that's okay. You can also look at external costs. So this might be from some comparable municipalities. They might have something you can use. The province or your conservation authority might have some data, or even the academic literature, as Sarah mentioned, the City of London used for some of their evaluation. So what type of costs do you include in this? So we're going to look at the Public Sector Accounting Board for directions on this. And what they say to include is, and I quote, all costs directly attributable to acquisition, construction, or development of the asset. So for street trees, what does this mean? An example of costs that you might include here are removing the previous tree, site preparation costs, dealing with the soil, you might have to do some remediation, new tree purchase, delivery and planting, maintenance and watering for the first 1 to maybe 5 years, and then you might have some professional fees associated with that, like design or legal.
Michelle, I do have a question here. When we are talking built infrastructure, the capital cost is to get it into service, and then maintenance we think would be through our operating budget. We generally wouldn't include that in our capital cost. So I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more why we're including it here.
Yes, that's a great question. So I think you're probably talking about that second to last bullet point about maintenance and watering. And so why we include that here is that what we're really trying to achieve here is tree establishment. So if you plant a street tree and you don't water it or maintain it for those first couple of years, it will probably die. So what we're saying here is that watering and the pruning required to establish an adequate root system so that the trees should really be considered, those maintenance costs in those first couple of years should really be considered a capital cost because it's required to establish the tree and help it long-term grow to maturity. So ultimately, whether to include this here really depends on your municipality. That's not a decision that we can make, but ideally you want to be planting assets and maintaining them such that they do have a chance of surviving to maturity.
Thank you.
Okay, so I was going to pause here for a moment and ask Malik to open poll number 1, where we're going to ask everyone if your municipality has an internal benchmark cost for your street trees. So the options are yes, no, not sure, and not applicable.
Okay, the responses are coming in now. We're at the halfway point. With not sure having slightly more of an edge than the yeses, nos, and not applicables. And I'll share the results with you in a few seconds, just leaving people the opportunity to weigh in.
Okay, so yeah, so a lot of not sures, and that's not shocking, right? If you haven't started down this avenue, some no's, which again is fine. You can go to external benchmark costs, and then quite a few yeses as well, which is great. So that'll be very helpful when you're getting to your valuation piece. Okay, so now I'm going to pick on you, Jennifer. So does Oxford County have an internal benchmark cost for its street trees?
We're still very in the early stages of our process, so at this point in time, no, we do not have anything established.
Okay. All right, so that's not a problem. That's often the case, especially for smaller jurisdictions, we find. So for illustrative purposes, I'm going to use an external benchmark that's a fairly conservative but realistic estimate for street trees within areas with populations under 50,000. So that would be Woodstock. So I've put a number in there at $300 per tree. And so now that we have the benchmark cost, we need the number of trees. So with street trees, the most likely source of information would be a street tree inventory. And when we say inventory, we mean that every tree is generally counted. These are often stored in GIS. So here I have a lovely example from Guelph where the colored dots represent the streets, the trees on their streets, or inventories are often stored in Excel. And so this slide also has an example here of the inventory data set that Oxford County sent me in Excel. So Jennifer, based on the inventory you sent me, how many street trees does Oxford County have in Woodstock?
So just within the city of Woodstock, 957 street trees on county-owned roads.
On county roads, exactly. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we know how many trees you have. We now need to think a little bit about how you would replace a tree. So this is a picture of one large tree that I took in Stratford, Ontario. And we're curious to everyone on this call, you know, how would you replace this tree tomorrow? With how many nursery stock size trees? That's the other picture on this slide. How many of those smaller trees would you use to replace this large tree? And I'm going to ask Malik to pull up poll number 2.
Okay, so people are starting to vote. We've got roughly half the people who have done so. And we're kind of tied, I guess, with either 5 trees or more than 10 so far. The results are still coming in.
All right, so yeah, interesting. A lot of people saying 5 or more than 10. Quite a few people also saying 1 or 2. So we are going to get into options for both of those going forward. We were just curious what folks would think off the bat here. So can we end that poll? Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to show you 2 options for evaluation methods to address this question. And the first option is where one large tree is replaced by one small tree. So in this option, all trees, no matter what their size, have effectively the same value. So an advantage of this approach is that the replacement costs can be used to directly calculate costs later in the asset management plan, so especially the life cycle management plan and in financial planning stages, because ultimately on street trees you probably are actually only planting one tree to replace those trees, right? But the big disadvantage of this approach is that it does not account for that delay in service provision. So when you replace one large tree with one small tree, you are reducing your levels of service quite significantly for a while. So the second option is to replace one large tree with multiple small trees in the valuation. So because large trees provide exponentially more services, the idea is that you would need multiple small trees to achieve the same levels of service to meet your current replacement cost definition. So the advantage of this approach is that it accounts for the delay in service provision. The disadvantage is that it does require a little bit more data. So this slide is a summary of the data needs for both options. So option 1 requires that you know how many trees you have. And then for option 2, you need to know how many trees you have and their size. And so ideally you have their size in some sort of diameter information. Okay, so with a little bit more information about those 2 options, I'm wondering what options folks on the line would lean towards at this point in terms of replacing a large tree. So Malik, could you please pull up poll number 3? So again, option 1 is a 1-to-1 replacement of a large tree, and option 2 is 1-to multiple. We'll give people a minute to do this if they want to think about it.
Yeah, I think so. We have a little bit more than half who've already
Yeah.
weighed in.
While that's happening, for our non-tree people, could you break out DBH for us? I don't think that, sorry if I missed it, but I don't think you.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So DBH means diameter at breast height. So that is in the tree area, how we measure a size tree. It's looking at the diameter of the tree at about your breast height. Okay, perfect. So we have about 70% opting for option 2 and then about 30% for option 1. That's really interesting. Okay, thanks everyone. So I'm going to close this so you're not seeing that. All right, perfect. So now I'm going to pick on Jennifer. So which option would you like to move forward with at this point?
Well, I think I would look at it from a service standpoint, right? Our council would have established current levels of service and their expected levels of service. So I think in order to maintain our service, we would need to go with option 2.
Perfect. Okay, so then if we go with option 2 here, we have to make one more decision. And so that is, what size tree do we replace that large tree with? So there are a few options here. And the first option is to replace a large tree with smaller trees of a certain diameter. So on the top here, I've replaced that one 8-inch diameter tree with trees of 4-inch diameter. And so you would end up with 2 trees replacing that one large tree. You could also replace that large tree with slightly smaller trees. So if you look at replacing it with 2-inch trees, you would have 4 trees replacing one, 4 2-inch trees replacing one 8-inch tree. And then finally, this last option, and this is mainly for the forestry people on the line, is that we can also use the CLTA trunk formula method to determine the number of replacement trees. So Jill Ann mentioned this approach. It's an arborist appraisal method that is pretty well validated. It's used in court cases when you have conflicts around trees, but it is slightly more complicated because it does consider things like location and condition of the trees. So if you do have this information about your trees, it definitely could be used here. And what we found is that it results in slightly more trees replacing the same large trees. So in this example, it would depend a little bit on condition, but we would probably see about 5 trees replacing that one 8-inch large tree. So deciding on this point will generally mean, looking a little bit, if you have an internal benchmark, what size tree do you plant? Do you have the trunk formula method data on your street trees? But I know this is just an example, Jennifer, so I'm going to ask you to pick one of these options so that we can move forward with the valuation piece.
I think the 2-inch caliber.
Okay, so kind of like the median choice. Yeah. Perfect. Okay.
So Michelle, before you move on, we do have a couple of questions and comments in the chat box that I think are relevant here. So
okay.
First of all, a comment, asset management is about like for like replacement. So not sure why we have multiple trees. And I think that Jennifer's response gave a bit of insight to that, looking at service levels, but perhaps it's worth talking about why we would be considering multiple tree replacement options. And then related to that, I'm going to throw a second question at you. Are you looking at what size of tree will establish best, e.g. whips but need more? I'm sorry, I'm not sure actually what the end of that question means, but are you looking at what size of tree will establish the best? And then finally, how does species fit into this? How would you decide which species to replace the old tree with? So a few different questions there, but I think they're all quite related to this choice. So if you could take a moment to address those before you move on.
Yes, so absolutely. So the first question, it really comes down to looking at the definition of replacement cost and the fact that this is a fundamental difference between a tree and a traditional asset. So you build your new asset, you're getting the same level of service. If you replace a large tree with a small tree, you are not getting the same required level of service. Now, as we go through this example, it will come down to a municipal decision, and different municipalities have handled this differently. So that's why we're kind of presenting it as two options, because they're both valid, and it really depends on how your municipality makes your priorities and makes your decisions around asset management planning. But a like-to-like replacement for a natural asset really isn't the same as gray infrastructure, and that really comes down to the fact that it's not providing the same number of services if you plant a small tree. And so that's why we generally encourage, if possible, to use the one-to-multiple replacement cost method, and that is also what the City of London did in their asset management plan.
If I could just jump in too for a sec for the like-to-like replacement when we talk about the gray infrastructure. You know, part of the stuff that the regulation requires from us is that we have to consider growth in that. We have to consider climate change. So if our pipes now are, our stormwater pipes, for example, are fine for the 2-year storm, and 5 years from now that 2-year storm is significantly higher and our pipes no longer account for that, we're no longer replacing like for like. We're having to replace that pipe that's in the ground with a higher diameter pipe in order to maintain that same level of service. Same with our roads. If we're widening our roads, we're not replacing like for like, we're having to replace it with something different. So we do need to account for some of those changes in our asset management plan, so it's not strictly a like-to-like replacement, even with the gray infrastructure.
Perfect.
Thanks very much. And I think it sounds like some of those considerations that Sarah raised in her presentation before the break would come into deciding about how many trees to factor in. So quickly, just to remind you, the other questions were related to size of tree that will establish best, or how species factors in.
Yes, so the size of tree will sort of circle back a bit to your benchmark cost most likely, and really you should probably use the tree the size you're most likely to replace. So on a street tree situation, you'll probably use a larger size caliper tree because it'll have a larger survival, a more, you can't really plant a sapling along your street tree and expect it to, or a street, sorry, and expect it to survive. But so those are sort of decisions that'll again be municipality to municipality, and it will not be the same, and that's okay. It doesn't need to be the same for every municipality. It really depends on your context and how you manage your street trees. And I think the same would apply to species as well. That's definitely a little bit more of a urban forest management plan type question. It's definitely critically important, but it won't necessarily affect your number of trees you're replacing it with, but it might affect your benchmark depending on the type of tree and the species that you're choosing to plant. Did we cover everything?
Yes, thanks very much,
great.
Michelle. And one final question that's just come in before you move on. For tree replacement, are they planted on city/county/municipally owned properties, or are they offered to private landowners closest, i.e. if they're removed within the right-of-way in front of a house?
Yeah, so what we're talking about here is all the trees that you are responsible for in a municipality. So it really depends on your municipality. So definitely the trees that are on your land that you plant. And if you do take responsibility for maintaining and planting trees on the private property at the edge of their lands, then you would maybe include them as well in your asset management plan. But you also might not. It kind of depends on your decision making and who and what your level of responsibility is and who owns the trees.
Perfect. Thanks, Michelle. Lots of subjective questions here that come down to municipality by municipality decision making processes.
All right, so we have the number of trees that they have on their streets, their county streets in Woodstock. So that was 957. And then you provided me with your inventory spreadsheet. So I take the liberty of sort of adding a column to create the number of replacement trees per tree in your inventory, assuming we replaced each tree with a 2-inch caliper tree. So now in your 957 trees, you have trees that range in size from 0 to 44 inches in diameter. So the 0, likely there's no data, and then 44 inches is quite a large tree. So in this spreadsheet, any tree with a diameter of 0 to 3 inches will have 1 replacement tree, while the trees that have 44 inches will be replaced by 22 trees. And then obviously there are lots of tree sizes in between those two extremes. But it's fairly simple to add 1 column and divide it by the size of tree you want to look at. Again, we're working in inches here because that's what the data was provided in inches, so it's just easier not to do all the conversions. And then at the bottom of that column, we add up all the replacement trees. And we get an equivalent number of trees, which for Oxford County is 4,978 trees. So now we input that number into our table. So we take the 4,978 and multiply it by our benchmark cost of 300 to get an asset value of 1.49 million. So again, this is using the one-to-multiple replacement tree approach, but there are probably a few people on the line, especially based on our polls, who might be curious about the results if we use the one-to-one replacement option. So I have also run those numbers. So for comparison purposes here, this is the one-to-one approach. So you multiply 300 by 957 to get an asset value of $287,000. So compared to the one-to-multiple approach, you see the value is about 5 times lower. So that's it. As I mentioned earlier, this is an approach for single trees, so park trees and street trees. The method would be slightly different for forests or wetlands because we definitely don't expect people to count every tree in your forest. And Jennifer, thank you so much for being my guinea pig. I know this is a lot of information I've kind of thrown at you, but I am curious if you have any thoughts or comments about this asset value that you might want to finish off with.
Yeah, I think it is a big range, and we've touched on this a couple of times. It really comes down to municipality, right? So replacing to keep the same service level today obviously has huge impacts on service levels down the road once that tree gets mature and established. And, you know, as development happens, I think there's an expectation by residents that the county or the municipalities replace those trees in order to provide that level of services taken away when those developments are clear-cutting areas. So I think there's a lot of discussions that need to happen with council, with planning, to really go through and determine what the municipality chooses as far as how it does the valuation with the one-to-one or one-to-many.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, the key thing here is that you use a current replacement cost methodology, that you're compliant with the regulation and best practice. And both of these options really do use that methodology as the approach. You know, for both of those, we took the benchmark cost times the quantity or number of trees to get the value. And, you know, option 1 or option 2, sort of both are okay, and it really depends on some, you know, decision making within your municipality. And I would argue that the one-to-multiple approach is the better replacement for the levels of service, but ultimately it's up to your asset management folks. All right, so thank you again, Jennifer, and I'll pass it back over to the other Jennifer to wrap things up today.
Yeah, so thank you both. I think that was a really interesting dialogue. And what we'd like to do now is open up for questions. So I see a couple coming in already. Chris and I will pull your questions out of the chat and Certainly if you have questions directly for Michelle, but if there are questions for any of the other speakers, please feel free to add those as well. So the first question, what kind of useful life range is City of London using for street trees? So that's actually, maybe someone from the City of London wants to chime in on that one.
I will. I was thinking maybe Sarah would have some input too. Our goal, our benchmark for our life cycle costs, I do believe is 40 years for a street tree, but reality is different. So off the top of my head, I think we're using 40 years for street trees for life cycle.
Sarah, if you do want to chime in, feel free. Otherwise, I will, we do have another question as well. Does your $300 benchmark cost include all of the example costs in your what cost to include slide? Oh, Sarah, I see you've unmuted. Would you like to address the useful life range question?
Yes. I'm not going to dispute what Joanne said. It's something we have discussed at length in different strategic and policy documents that we have developed over the years. Most recent discussion we had around this was with our tree planting strategy, where we had to work out how many trees we needed to plant to achieve our canopy cover goals. Obviously, you have to plant more if their life expectancy is short. One of the things that you do need to look at is the difference between a life cycle and a half-life. And I'm not the expert on this, but there is a difference. And I understand that the leaning now is to look towards a half-life. So I'll have to perhaps send some papers out to people if they want to learn more about that, because as I say, I'm not the expert. I just know that there is a difference. And that may drip into future strategic documents and also into our asset management. I'm not disputing the 40-year thing, that the 40-year life cycle that Joanne mentioned, but my understanding is that many municipalities have a life expectancy much below that, and a half-life approach apparently gives better clarity around that. But as I say, I'm not the expert, but I'd be happy to contribute to the discussion as to what's the correct number there. It might be much lower than 40.
Thanks, Sarah. Michelle, is this something you've looked at all in your investigation into other municipalities?
Well, I mean, there's always, I mean, you need to set a life cycle number for your street trees to do the life cycle part of an asset management plan. And we've seen as low as of 25 on like highways and as high as about 50 on residential streets. So there's a huge range. And ideally, a lot of larger municipalities anyway do have data on their survival, so they can use that to,
based on historical inventorying data.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Sarah, sorry, Sarah here again. Just to reiterate what Michelle was just talking about, yes, there will be different life expectancies depending on where the trees are. And we generally hope that our parkland trees perhaps have a 100-year life cycle, just because they're not experiencing the same challenges that a tree on the street would. So there will be different life cycles with different circumstances for sure.
Great. Thanks very much. So let's return to the benchmark question. So Michelle, this one's directly for you. Does your $300 benchmark cost include all of the example costs in your what to include slide?
Yes, good question. So no, it actually does not include all of those costs. And there's a very specific reason why. We, first of all, wanted to include sort of a round number for the calculation purposes today. It probably won't be such a round number for an actual benchmark cost. And then also was trying to err on the side of more conservative, because it is a smaller municipality. We see huge ranges in the costs and the amount it costs to plant a street tree, and it definitely depends if you use soil cells or structural soils or tree trenches or tree pits, or if you're just planting on the side of the road. So there's a huge range, and we erred on the side of the more conservative side of that range for this example.
Thank you.
There's a good question about, and it's a hypothetical, but you can tease out some of the implications from this. But the question is, when you have an old tree, let's say in the downtown core, and let's say that tree dies or gets hit by a car, you're obviously not able to plant, let's say, 5 trees in the same spot to replace it. And so if you're going to be using the trunk diameter method you're going to need multiple trees to make up that difference. But what are you going to do if that geographic locale won't take the, let's say 5 trees in that, where that 1 tree used to be? Is there a rule that's applied to determine that?
So that is a really great question, and I'll take a moment here to clarify something, especially when we're talking about street trees and within the asset management plan for natural infrastructure. The asset value is, if you're going to use this one-to-multiple approach, is not necessarily the same number you will use in the life cycle or financial strategies. So that is one of the advantages I listed of the one-to-one approach, because in reality, on the ground, you are not necessarily going to replace one large street tree with multiple street trees because of the context and the fact that there's only one spot for one tree. So when it comes to the financial planning side of things, you really should be doing, the number that you will actually be replacing. But we really want to make sure, with respect to asset value, that we have the larger trees accounted for in that. When we're using it as a benchmark, if people take that value out and use it for other purposes with respect to development or anything else, we want to make sure that that value reflects the size of the tree. And that's why we really advocate for this approach. But it does not necessarily mean you are actually going to replace each of your trees with multiple trees in the street tree context.
There's further to what Michelle is saying. There's broader policy implications that are really interesting. So, for example, if you have development in your municipality, right now, like replacing natural assets is not considered it's not considered an eligible services under the development charges regime, and that's something that is worth. It's a policy discussion that needs and should take place, especially if the province is interested in really integrating some of the natural asset or environmental considerations in the way it does development. So that's another consideration just down the line when you're valuing this and when you're talking to developers about, let's say, remediation may be necessary if they're going to be developing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's really a great tool for looking at the value of existing trees beyond, what's traditionally been done, looking at them purely as timber value or looking at them as just an obstacle that needs to be removed in order to develop on that site. And so, while, to Michelle's point, you may not replace a really large old tree with the exact number per the formula, it gives a sense of the value that tree represents in place. So a lot of potential implications of going through this process for each municipality. We've got a couple additional questions that have come in. Does anyone have an update regarding discussions in moving towards recognizing natural assets in public sector accounting? So Michelle, I think you have a bit of an update on this.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a funny story going back. We first at TRCA, we looked into including our natural assets in our financial statements in 2015, and our auditors came back to us with this newsletter about how there's a restriction on inherited natural assets. And so we shared that with the Geo Coalition, and then they tweeted out at the PSTAB folks about this restriction, and they actually called us up off of a tweet, which is so funny. And so since then, we've been actually working with them, and they've hired a few consultants to do some studies, and we were very lucky because they're quite supportive of moving towards natural assets being in financial statements. And we were incredibly lucky because they're doing something called updating the conceptual framework for accounting standards. So this is something that only happens once in every generation, and it's something that they started a couple years ago. And so we were able to, as part of that process, have the conceptual framework pieces that were causing that barrier potentially be eliminated. So in their updated conceptual framework, there are mechanisms where now the standards could eventually be changed. And that sounds like a very long process, and then that's because it is. So accounting standards take, a decade to change, but we were very lucky that they're updating this conceptual framework, and they're in the process of doing that. And then once that's been finalized, we can move towards getting reviews on those standards to having that barrier to inclusion of natural assets be removed. Now, I will say that this is just for inherited natural assets. So your natural forests, your natural wetlands, a lot of the green infrastructure assets that we talk about, like this example today, like street trees, those can be included in financial statements right now because they're not inherited and they have a cost associated with them. But so we're moving forward with the accountants slowly but surely.
I just want to add to what Michelle is saying, Joanna, and it's a really good question. There's, I think several groups are trying to work together to update some of those standards as per the once every 5-year review of the conceptual framework that Michelle mentioned. But CPA Canada, GI, the Green Infrastructure Ontario Coalition, Asset Management Ontario, Municipal Finance Officers Association, CPA Canada, PSAB, we're all trying to work together. And I think what might happen is first for a set of what they call recommendations to come forward. And then they kind of see how that plays out in the field, so to speak. And before they actually make that into the letter of the law. Yeah. A shout out to the Intact Center for Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. Does a lot of really good work, and they definitely should be part of those discussions.
Okay, thank you very much. That's great. So reasons for optimism and progress is happening there. Just perhaps not as quickly as we would all like on the ground, but moving forward nonetheless. We're really excited to be part of those discussions. We do have a couple more questions that have come in. So from Maureen, for budgeting purposes, how do you determine the annual cost of tree replacement? Does an annual capital cost have to be considered?
Do you guys want me to answer that, or Jillian, do you want to tackle that?
Well, Michelle, why don't you get started? Jillian has dropped out of view for me.
Oh, okay.
It may take a minute for her to get her audio going. Certainly, any of the other speakers who have thoughts on this could chime in afterwards as well.
Yeah, so I mean, it will depend on your municipality. So does annual capital costs getting considered in terms of tree replacement? And generally, I would say that that's a yes. Your trees are capital assets, and like we were talking about a little bit in the workshop, we even argue that some sort of early stage maintenance should be even considered a capital cost when it comes to establishing trees. And then your more long-term pruning cycles or watering over the life cycle of the tree, that would be operations and maintenance. So in terms of like the benchmark cost of the tree, that would be your capital costs, and we would argue some of that early maintenance would be included. The annual cost of tree replacement, I guess I don't quite understand what you mean there. Did that answer your question?
Okay, Maureen, please feel free to type into the chat if that has answered your question or not, if you have any follow-up thoughts. It does seem that that Jillian has been pulled away temporarily. Okay. I don't know if anybody else that. Oh, Maureen says yes, it was just a general question, so that did address it. And we do have one additional question right now. Perhaps this will be our final question and we can move into some concluding statements. So from Samantha, how are natural assets such as creeks that run over different landowners treated? Do you only include the portion of the creek on city lands or the entire length within the municipality, i.e. the whole creek may provide stormwater conveyance, but the city would not typically maintain the creek or the creek banks on area we do not own? So complicated question, I know, Michelle, I see you smiling. I'm sure you've got some thoughts.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I have a couple thoughts. So the first being, yes, in your asset management plan, you'll likely be focusing on areas that you are responsible for or that you own, and creeks are often the trickiest. And you know, you might have sort of an easement or an agreement with a private property owner, in which case you probably would include it, even if it is on private property, in your asset management plan. If it just runs through private property, this is a question that we are still debating. So you'll see that Khalid mentioned they don't actually have their rivers in their asset management plan yet. We've been working with a couple other municipalities with trying to figure out how to include water courses, especially ones that run on private property. And this is one of the areas in natural asset management that is still sort of evolving. So we're really hoping to convene folks, you know, that we've done a lot of work on urban forestry. They've tended to be the leaders, and it's tended to be because they have a lot of data going back for decades. But there are still some other assets, and water courses are the biggest one, where there are some tricky questions that we need to address. So we're really hoping to convene folks to work through those and come up with a really valid methodology as well. So if you're interested in being part of those conversations, Samantha, let Jennifer, I know we'd be happy to include you.
With that, thank you very much, everyone. Just in closing, I wanted to thank all the speakers, the organizer, Malik Sidki, as well as all of you who participated in this. Our next event is actually going to be, next major event is going to be a Climate Change and Asset Management Virtual Conference. It's from February 22nd to 25th. We will be sending out more information about this. And we are a community of practice, and if you're interested in suggesting a future workshop topic or in volunteering, please reach out to info@amontario.ca. And thank you again to everyone, and we will follow up with an email just with more links and also with the presentations. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Chris, you may want to stop the recording.